Are you looking to add a little bit of Warhammer Fantasy to your games of Shadowdark? If so, stay tuned, because I may have just the thing. Hey folks, I'm William, this is Runeforged, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at a brand new Shadowdark supplement called Shadows of Empire by Fenris77. I did want to point out that while this is not a sponsored video, I did receive a free preview copy of this supplement from the author. So a big thank you to Fenris for sending this over. And as always, there is a link down in the video description for you to pick up a copy of this adventure on DriveThruRPG if you are so inclined. And there are also links to some of the author's other work on various different platforms if you'd like to check those out for yourself. All right, so what is Shadows of Empire? Well, it's a relatively short, like 34-page Shadowdark supplement that gives you some of the resources that you would need to run a campaign in a setting that is very similar to the Empire from the Warhammer Fantasy setting. And we'll do a deeper dive into each of these sections in just a minute. But here is like a brief overview of the various different resources that are included in this supplement. First of all, we've got like several random tables to add quite a bit of variety and flavor to the setting. So you've got tables for like various different people that you might run into, different types of caravans, folk festivals, different kinds of local delicacies, so like food and drink, very cool. Also guilds and brotherhoods, and of course the standard rumor table. There are also several new player-facing character options. I think the highlight of that is probably 3 new player character classes. First, we've got the Lancer, which is, I guess it's meant to be like a winged Lancer, winged Hussar kind of character from like a Kislev analog. It really does feel very much like a minor reskin of the Desert Rider from Curse Scroll number 2. So if you're a fan of that class, you'll probably also enjoy this one. We've also got the Merchant class, who, despite the name, is fairly competent in a combat situation, while also still bringing quite a bit of social utility to the party. And then finally, we've got the Sentinel, which is kind of like a bounty hunter or like a witch hunter kind of character, that really feels fairly similar to a fighter, but also has a lot of those utility elements that you would expect for a bounty hunter type of character. Very cool, and probably my favorite of the 3 classes that are presented in this book. Then there's also a ton of new equipment options. We've got new melee weapons, we've got rules for firearms, new armor, as well as barding for characters' mounts, and a couple other pieces of miscellaneous equipment. Next, there's also a bestiary that includes a pretty wide variety of creatures, especially for such a relatively small book. So you've got sections for beastmen, gutterkin, which is this world's equivalent of skaven. There's also a section for freebooters, which are kind of like random mercenaries or one-offs that you might expect to encounter in the world, like a dwarven slayer or an elven swordmaster. And of course, there's a whole section on orcs, which is probably my favorite of the bunch and the one that we'll probably highlight in this video. And of course, you can't have a Warhammer adjacent setting without some chaos. And of course, there are some stat blocks for some chaos-associated creatures, including several different demons that will be very familiar if you are a fan of the Warhammer Fantasy setting. And finally, there are a bunch of new mechanics and kind of flavor to sprinkle on top of everything else. So we've got rules for corruption, mutations. We've got some flavor around so-called black crystals, which I think are this world's equivalent of warpstone. There's also some rules for explosives, as well as diseases and lingering injuries. And there's also a section for the gods of the Empire, which are essentially reskins of what you would see in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. So as you can see, that's actually quite a bit of content that's crammed into these like 34 or so pages. And I think I also saw on the DriveThruRPG page that there are like 2 like short one-shot adventures that kind of acts as a supplement to this material, but I don't think I received a copy of those, so I won't be talking about those in this video. All right, so before we get any deeper, I did just want to say, if you are enjoying the video so far, please consider aiding me in my eternal struggle against the dreaded YouTube algorithm by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more exciting Shadowdark content like this in the future. Also, if you'd really like to go above and beyond, please consider checking out the DriveThruRPG affiliate links that are located down in the video description. Any purchases you make after clicking on one of those links does help to support the channel at no additional cost to you. And one of those links goes to my very own Shadowdark adventure against the Cult of the Crimson Hand. And you can pick that up for free, technically pay what you want, on DriveThruRPG using the link down in the description. All right, with that out of the way, let's get back to Shadows of Empire. All right, so as I alluded to earlier, there are several different random tables in this supplement that help you add some variety and flavor to your game. And I've got one up on the screen right now that is specifically related to various different rumors you might encounter during your game. And I think one of my favorite things about this supplement is I think it does a really good job of capturing like the core essence of what Warhammer Fantasy is, especially the Empire part of that setting. And as I mentioned earlier, there are like maybe a dozen or more different tables like this throughout the book. Will help you add a lot of additional flavor to your game. So very, very cool. Next, I wanted to talk about the character classes that are included with the supplement. Specifically, I want to focus on the Sentinel. As I mentioned earlier, this is very much a bounty hunter or witch hunter inspired character. And I think does a pretty good job of also alluding to some of the new weapons and armor that are included in the supplement. I have not had a chance to run any of these new classes at the table, but I do get the feeling that the Sentinel in particular does look fairly balanced and is definitely very on brand for the setting. I think the closest analog to the Sentinel in the core Shadowdark game is probably going to be the Fighter, as the Hunter's Mark ability is very reminiscent to the core Fighter ability. The big trade-off being that the Sentinel is not able to wear as heavy armor as the Fighter, but instead gets some social and utility type of perks. One of those being Liar's Tell, which allows you to pass a wisdom test to determine if someone is lying to you. And another is Ear to the Ground, which while you're in a settlement allows you to get some additional information on potential bounties that you might be able to pick up while you're in town. And of course, you've also got Hunter's Lore, which gives you advantage on some of the checks associated with your craft. So overall, I think a very solid attempt at this type of class. Here we can find some of the classic black and white artwork that you can expect while going through the supplement. I did just want to point out that this adventure is made by pretty much by a one-man team. I think there is some supplemental writing credits in there. But I know recently on the channel, we've been looking at some, really high budget, fairly large teams, like kind of working on a single project. But from time to time, I also like to spotlight some smaller or up-and-coming creators who are making some really cool stuff. And that, combined with my love of the Warhammer Fantasy setting, is why I chose to highlight this particular supplement on the channel. In this supplement, there are also a variety of new weapons added. You can see the new melee weapons here, and we'll also talk about the firearms that have been added in just a minute. Overall, I think this list does a pretty good job of supplementing the existing weapon list to add some additional options that would be, more common in the kind of more Renaissance era Empire from Warhammer Fantasy. There are a couple of odd design choices, like the heavy crossbow doing 1d8 plus 1 damage, when I think just a flat 1d8 would have been just fine. I also did notice that the heavy crossbow doesn't have the loading property like the normal crossbow does. I'm not sure if that was an intentional choice or maybe just an oversight. I think we'll probably have to wait and see if that gets updated in the future. I did particularly like the, I think it's a main gouge. I'm not sure if that's how it's actually pronounced, but in my mind, it's kind of like a parrying dagger. I really liked the implementation of that here. It is meant to be like an offhand weapon, but in keeping with kind of Shadowdark's core design philosophy where characters are not usually making multiple attacks on a single round, this offhand weapon doesn't give you a whole other attack. Instead, each round the wielder can choose whether or not they want to get advantage on their attack rolls, I guess kind of emulating the fact that they're using their offhand dagger for offense, or they can choose to get +1 to their armor class, kind of emulating the fact that they're using this weapon for defense, which I think is a really smooth and clean implementation for this style of offhand weapon. So I really like that. I will say there are a couple places in this supplement where kind of the design or the language used does deviate, in some cases fairly significantly from the core Shadowdark style. And I think in general, I would probably prefer if it hewed a little bit more closely to the default Shadowdark way of doing things. So one example of this here is it says polearms gain +1 TH, which I think is +1 to hit. Whereas I think typically in Shadowdark you might see like you get +1 to attacks with this weapon or something like that. But I think as long as you have an understanding as the GM at your table of how these various different things work or how you want them to work, I don't think this is I don't think this is a huge issue or a deal breaker, at least for me personally. There is also some notes on backwards compatibility here in the class availability section, which grants proficiency with some of these new weapons to some of the original classes. There are also several new firearms available in the supplement. Again, in keeping with the more Renaissance era level of technology that you do see in the Empire for the Warhammer Fantasy setting. And I do think that there's a pretty good variety of weapons here. And I think that they do a pretty good job of differentiating themselves for like different purposes and also price ranges. I won't go into too much detail about any of the individual weapons, but I will just say overall, I think they are pretty cool. One thing that I particularly liked was, as expected, these kind of, more experimental type of weapons do have a misfire chance associated with them. And different weapons have different modifiers like to the misfire table. So some of the more like less reliable weapons are more likely to have worse outcomes when you happen to roll a misfire. And I think for the most part, I do like some of the various different options that are included. And one thing that I am noticing right now as I'm looking at the smoke entry, and it says a 10 by 10 cloud of thick smoke. I'm like, 10 by 10 is not like a unit of measurement that you would typically do in Shadowdark. I have seen like double close, and that would be the equivalent of like 10 by 10. That feels a little bit fiddly for my taste, but I understand what it's trying to do, and you're just going to have to make a decision for yourself about whether or not that is problematic for you at your own table. Personally, I play all my games of Shadowdark on a grid anyway, so this would not be a huge problem for me to implement personally. I do, in some cases, feel like it is kind of a blind spot in the Shadowdark system that we don't have something like a 10 by 10 or a 15 by 15 foot cube, but it kind of is what it is. But back to the misfire table. I went off on a tangent there. Back to the misfire table. The one thing that I don't really particularly care for about this misfire table is that the best effects for the user of the weapon are on the low rolls of the D10, where I would expect that the best outcomes for the user to be on the higher end of the dice roll. And at the end of the day, this probably isn't a huge deal, but it is kind of confusing when you think about it in the context of there are certain weapons that allow you to roll on this table with advantage. And typically to me, that means rolling 2 dice and taking the highest. Technically, it says like choosing the best score or whatever. So in this case, the best score might be low, but it is kind of like counterintuitive to the typical way that I would think about the Shadowdark system. So again, just be aware of that going in if this is something that you are thinking about picking up for yourself. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the Bestiary for the supplement. And I think this is probably the best part about Shadows of Empire overall. I think I talked about this recently in my last video about Righteous Vow Volume 2. Definitely go check that video out if you're so inclined. But I really do like it when there are multiple different stat blocks for like the same humanoid type of creature. I really like to run like mixed combat patrols in my games. So I don't just want like, 1d6 orcs. I want like a couple orc melee dudes. I want a couple orc archers. I want maybe an orc shaman, maybe like an orc elite that's leading them. And then maybe like a troll attached to that or something. And while the base Shadowdark rules do offer some options for those, like there's multiple different, like there's maybe like 1 or 2 different stat blocks for orcs or goblins or whatever. This supplement really does go all in and giving you a lot of variety for each of the different factions. So here you can see that you've got options for snotlings, you've got a normal orc, you've got a gray orc, which is I think kind of their stand-in for the black orc that you would see in Warhammer Fantasy. You've also got an orc chieftain, which is kind of like their leader kind of dude. And then there's also like a mountain troll, which is like their heavy, big, brute kind of bruiser character. And again, I really just do like the level of variety that we're getting here in this supplement. And there's not just orcs in here. I think I talked about it earlier, but there's also Gutterkin, which is like Skaven. There's Beastmen, although that one doesn't have quite as much variety as the other ones do. I'd like to see that be fleshed out a little bit more. And there's also some stat blocks for the minions of chaos. And again, that's another one I'd like to see fleshed out a little bit more. But there are several different types of demons for each of the various different chaos gods, so I think that is very cool. But you're also not just getting stat blocks for the various different factions, you're also getting some very cool, fun, and flavorful random tables. So here you can see a D10 list of what argument an orc patrol might be having when the characters find them in the world. And some of these are very funny, and all of them are very thematic to the world of Warhammer Fantasy. I think number 1 on this chart really does encapsulate everything that you need to know if you are familiar with the Warhammer Fantasy world. And it's the orcs are arguing about which choppas are the best choppas and why those choppas aren't the ones that you're using, which is so funny and very on brand for my conception of what orcs are in this setting. And then in addition to the arguments, there's also a table for what the orcs are doing when you encounter them. And again, this is just another way to insert a little bit of variety and flavor into your encounters out in the world. Very, very cool. As I pointed out earlier, there's not necessarily like a ton of artwork in this book, and I don't think any of it is like custom made for the supplement itself. But I think the author did a pretty good job of kind of finding free images that go pretty well with the setting, and I think this is a really good example. This could very much be like an altar to one of the orc gods, and it is just like mounds upon mounds of bones of sacrifices that have been made to Gork and Mork or whatever their equivalent is in this setting. There's also a section in here, they call it freebooters, which are basically like different mercenaries or one-offs from the various other factions that you would expect to see in the Warhammer world that aren't necessarily the focus of this first supplement. And one of the examples is a Swordmaster, which is meant to be an analog for one of the Swordmasters of Hoth from the High Elven faction in Warhammer Fantasy. And this is one of my favorite archetypes. It always has been, going back to the very beginning of my entrance into the hobby. And I was really excited to see it represented in the supplement. And I think that the author did a really good job of kind of capturing the essence of what a High Elf swordsman is. In a relatively small package, so a very Shadowdark friendly package, which I really appreciate. And I think the core part of that is these 2 abilities. Blade Master, all rolls for initiative and damage are made with advantage. perfect, makes perfect sense to me. And then hubris, will never turn down a challenge to a duel. And this is very much right on the nose for what I would expect for this type of NPC. Very, very cool. There are also some rules for corruption in this supplement. And I'm not going to go into them in a super detail. Feel free to pause and read at your own leisure, or better yet, just go pick up a copy of the PDF for yourself over on TTRPG, link down in the description. I will say this. I like the idea of a corruption system, and I think there's some good stuff in what is written here. But this is another one of those instances where the way that this supplement is written kind of contrasts and bounces off the way that I would expect to see a Shadowdark supplement written. And an example of this is when you are testing corruption, which is basically like how you, like when you get corruption, you're going to test to see if you get some sort of mutation as a result of the corruption that you've obtained so far. And in order to do that test, you're rolling a D10, adding a modifier, and checking against like a difficulty class. I don't really see a reason why this couldn't just be like a D20 check. And incorporate it into the typical Shadowdark system. Now, while it does rub me the wrong way a little bit, that doesn't by any means mean that this is an unusable system. It is just something that I noticed and that stuck out to me. Now, I will concede like there may be a very good reason why it's a D10 check and not a D20 check, but I'm not exactly sure what that reason could be. Without beating a dead horse, I would prefer that it adhere a little more closely to the core Shadowdark philosophy and way that it handles its rules. And as I alluded to earlier, there are consequences to building up this corruption, and that comes in the form of usually physical mutations or corruptions to your character. And here's a list of some of the various bad things that might happen to your character when they are exposed to this corruption. So you've got, on one side of the column, you got the description, and on the other side, you can see some of the various different effects. For the most part, I think these are pretty on par. There are some that I raise my eyebrow a little bit. So the corruption is like an upside down face, which seems really, really bad. And the effect is all social interactions are made at disadvantage. I'm not sure that is a significant enough penalty for having your face being upside down. Especially in the world of Warhammer, especially in the Empire where people are very much on the lookout for like signs of witchcraft and chaos corruption. I think any reasonable, normal person who sees someone with an upside down face, it's going to be a lot more impactful than just like having social interaction roles at disadvantage. I think this would probably be closer along the lines of like any normal person who sees you like will run away from you instantly or try to fight you. One or the other. There's like no in between. But I think aside from that, it's pretty good. There are also like some instances like one of the effects is like -2 on social interaction rolls. This is another case where, typically in Shadowdark for those kinds of things, you don't see like a static modifier. It's either advantage or disadvantage. And again, as part of my overall critique of the supplement, I would like to see it adhere more closely to the core Shadowdark philosophy. But again, not by any means unusable. Just something to be aware of if you are thinking about picking this up for yourself. I did just want to highlight briefly this Minions of Chaos section, which I think probably should maybe belong in the Bestiary, but I think it's a little bit later in the book. I'm not going to go into the stat blocks for the individual chaos like characters and stuff. But I do like the idea of there being a high level chaos champion that might be a boss in one of your campaigns. And I like the way that it borrows from the Warhammer Fantasy mythos. And in that setting, typically chaos champions are dedicated to one of the 4 chaos gods, or they're dedicated to all of them in the form of being chaos undivided. And the way that manifests in this game is that each champion has a particular mark associated with it, which gives it some sort of special bonus as part of its stat block. But in addition to that, you can also add on various different chaos mutations, which will add a little bit more variety and flavor, to your fights with these various different champions, which you probably will be running into multiple different flavors of chaos champions over the course of a relatively long campaign. So I think it is cool that there is a lot of variety included in the stat block for these NPCs. And here you can see the D66 list of some of the various different mutations that you can give to your chaos champions. And I think it would be very on brand to roll randomly for each of your various different chaos champions that you put into your game. And hopefully you get something very bizarre and interesting each time you roll up something on this table. And as I alluded to earlier, there is some information about this settings version of the Gods of the Empire. I think these are pretty well named in that they are, reminiscent of the world of Warhammer, but also have tie-ins to our own worlds, legends and mythology. So that will probably make them a lot easier to remember than just kind of like your generic high fantasy names. And again, some very fitting black and white artwork. So there are also rules for diseases in this book. I want to say there's maybe 8 to 12 different varieties, ranging from extremely deadly, like the Black Plague here, to, just more like mild nuisance kind of diseases. And again, this very much follows the same critique that I have of the rest of the supplement. I think it does a really good job of capturing the core essence of, what Warhammer Fantasy is. I'd be a little bit worried about Black Plague in particular. I think it is accurate insofar as that it is extremely deadly and very likely to kill you. But this may be a little bit too deadly, for a tabletop RPG. I'm not going to go into super detail about the mechanics, but my understanding is you have to actually pass 3 DC 18 Constitution checks in a row to get rid of the Black Plague, which is almost impossible. And it's made even worse by the fact that each time you fail one of those checks, your Constitution is going down by another D3. So I think it is very, very, very unlikely that anyone is ever going to survive the Black Plague. I think maybe if you're going to do a system like this, maybe consider doing something like the D&D 5e death save system, where you want to get to 3 successes before you get to 3 failures. That would be a little bit more forgiving, I think. But trying to get 3 DC 18 Constitution checks in a row is, the chances on that I have to be astronomically low. So I think maybe a little bit more tweaking on the system is probably warranted. And as I alluded to earlier, there are also some additional rules for lasting injuries. And again, I won't go into too much detail about the actual mechanics for the system. You can read them on the screen right now. And I'm sure I feel like a broken record at this point. Again, very good job of replicating the feel of Warhammer Fantasy, even if I have some minor quibbles about the way things are worded or how the mechanics interact with the core system. All right, so what are my overall thoughts on Shadows of Empire? Well, I actually think it's a really solid start, and there's a lot to love about this supplement. But I also think it probably needs a little bit more polish and maybe a little bit more fleshing out for it to really live up to its full potential. So in terms of what I liked, I thought the supplement did a really good job of capturing the core essence of the Empire region within the Warhammer Fantasy setting. I also think that kind of given the design budget for this adventure, the layout looks really nice. Definitely a lot nicer than the Shadowdark adventure that I put out a couple months ago. I also think that there's already a lot of very practical value in the, particularly in the Bestiary section, as well as some of the new weapon options. For the Bestiary in particular, I really do like the variety of different creatures available for the various different antagonistic factions. In terms of what I didn't like as much, I think there's maybe just 2 or 3 kind of recurring themes. First was that I think some additional polishing probably needs to be done on this product. As I was reading through, I found a pretty decent amount of typos, formatting issues, stuff like that. And I also think that some of the writing for some of the various different rules and mechanics, probably could be tightened up and refined, even if just a little bit. As I mentioned, probably multiple times throughout the video. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but there are multiple places in the supplement where it diverges from the core Shadowdark design philosophy. And I don't necessarily think that is always a bad thing. But I will say in this particular supplement, I did find it to be a little bit jarring. And then I think the second major thing is I would really have loved to have seen a little bit more out of this initial installment. And I think in particular, I think that a small regional hex map for a starting area for a campaign in this setting would have been really good, with maybe 20 to 25 different points of interest, something very similar in size and scale to one of the official Cursed Scrolls themes. I think would have been a really good start. So again, the small regional hex map, and then also a level 1 starter adventure, something to kick off that very first session of the campaign. And I think that if those things were included, it would probably vastly reduce the barrier of entry for a GM who's trying to start a campaign in this setting. And then down the line, kind of more of a long-term thing. I'd love to see more, more classes, more monsters, regions, and adventures for the setting. And I will point out that I do think that 2 one-shot adventures do actually come with the adventure, but I didn't get a chance to look at those, so I really can't comment too much on what those might entail. But I do just want to point out that after I sat down and did the outline for this video, I did reach out to the author and let them know, like, that, you know, all the things that I really liked about the supplement, as well as some of the things that I didn't like as much. And I have to say that Fenris was really gracious in terms of the feedback that I gave him. In several cases, he was like, yes, absolutely, I think this needs to change. But also, to his credit, there were some things that he said, like, no, I have a very specific vision for what I'm trying to achieve with this product. And even though, you know, what you're saying makes sense in the context of Shadowdark, I'm trying to do something a little bit different, and this is how I'm going to keep it. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable response to have to certain types of feedback. But overall, very positive interaction with the author. Yeah, he acknowledged, like, yeah, hey, listen, the proofreading on this was kind of a mess. I think he mentioned that somehow, like, his spell checker got turned off in whatever layout tool that he was using, and he was really struggling to to get that under control. But long story short, I do expect that a lot of the typo related issues will be fixed in the very near future. So that's a very, very good sign. And I think, and then also the acknowledgement that, hey, yeah, maybe some more playtesting needs to be done on this as well. You know, I think that's really important. And just like an acknowledgement of that, I think is enough for me to feel good about the future of this project. And I think with all of that said, I am actually really excited to see more stuff from Fenris, especially in this Shadows of Empire setting. I think there's a huge amount of potential for Warhammer Fantasy type of setting in Shadowdark. So with all of that said, if Shadows of Empire has piqued your interest, there is a link to pick it up down in the video description. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider checking out my other Shadowdark reviews, which should be popping up on your screen right about now. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.